In this lecture, we will take a closer look at the vessels involved in circulation of blood throughout the body. Let's take a quick second to review again the three major classes of blood vessels. These are arteries, capillaries, and veins. As we had talked about in the heart lecture, arteries are the vessels that carry blood away from the heart and ultimately become progressively smaller as they branch and finally result in the capillaries. And you see that here, one of the great vessels being the aorta, this artery carrying blood away, branching ultimately into smaller arteries, ultimately then into arterioles, finally into the capillaries here. Likewise, veins return blood to the heart, and as you can see, become progressively larger as they merge and ultimately dump deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. Blood vessels have three different layers or tunics, much like we saw with three different layers of the heart tissue. The outer layer, or the tunica externa, consists of connective tissue that mostly helps anchor the blood vessel to organs throughout the body. The middle layer then is the tunica media. Again, you can see this layer is mostly comprised of circularly arranged smooth muscle, much again like we saw a smooth muscle layer in the middle layer of the heart. The tunica media you can see is a much larger layer in the arteries than it is in the veins, and this is because the arteries are under much more pressure, and so you have this muscle layer to deal with that pressure and also to help regulate blood pressure levels throughout the body. And lastly, the most inner layer is the tunica intima. This is composed mostly of simple squamous epithelial. It has an endothelium lining, but in addition it does have a subendothelial layer, which consists of a small amount of connective tissue. The details of the layers I don't expect you to remember, but I would like you to be familiar with the fact that the blood vessels have the three layers, which layer is the muscular layer, and also know that the arteries have a much larger tunica media than the veins. And here you see as well, in this inner layer, the tunica intima lines the inner region or the lumen. In essence, this is the pipe, if you will, through which the blood flows. Note that in the veins, the tunica intima, or the lumen, I should say, has a number of valves enclosed within the lumen, whereas the arteries do not have the valves. And this is because in the veins, there's much lower blood pressure, and in order to prevent the blood, again, from backflowing into the veins, a series of valves exist throughout the venous system. Let's take a closer look at the different types of arteries. All arteries are not essentially created equal. Three major types of arteries. There's elastic arteries, there's muscular arteries, and then there's arterioles. Let's first deal with the elastic arteries. These are the largest of the arteries. They include the aorta and the pulmonary artery. As you can imagine, the elastic name tells you that these are a bit more stretchy than the other two types. Most of the elastic arteries are those that are near the heart. As you can imagine, this is to deal with the higher blood pressure coming off the heart. The elastic fibers are present in all three tunics, and this allows these arteries to stretch under the high pressure generated by blood flow from the heart. And so you see elastic fibers both in the tunica intima as well as in the tunica media and the tunica externa. Ultimately, elastic arteries then branch into the second type we'll talk about, and those are the muscular arteries. Now, the muscular arteries pictured here in the middle, these are somewhat medium-sized in diameter, slightly smaller than the elastic arteries, but larger than the arterioles. Again, they have a much stronger or thicker, I should say, tunica media relative to the other two tunics, the tunica intima and the tunica externa. They have a proportionally thicker tunica media with smooth muscle fibers. And lastly, let's talk about the arterioles. These are the smallest arteries immediately prior to branching into the capillaries. They have less than 6 cell layers of smooth muscle in their tunica media. So you can imagine now these are getting quite small before branching immediately then into the capillaries. Now, the capillaries are the smallest of all the blood vessels, and their diameter is only slightly larger than an erythrocyte or a red blood cell, so they allow single cells to pass through one at a time. You can imagine then these are extremely small vessels. The wall consists solely of the tunica intima. There is no tunica media or tunica externa in the capillaries. And this is the only type of blood vessel where metabolic exchange can occur between the blood and the cells of the outside of the bloodstream, I should say. And so this is where you have the crosstalk between the circulatory system, if you will, and the cells or the tissues surrounding the circulatory network that need to either dump waste off or receive nutrients from the circulatory system and from the blood. As well, I should say, that it's within the capillaries where cells can leak out or leave the circulatory system and enter into the tissue network. And here we're talking mostly about immunocytes or cells that are part of the immune system. Okay, if we look at the capillaries, there's actually 3 different types of capillaries. A little bit greater detail about the capillaries. There's a continuous capillary. These are the most common capillaries. The endothelial cells form a continuous and complete lining. So in essence, the pipe system is complete at this point. There are some tight junctions which allow the cells to crosstalk with one another. And these continuous capillaries are found in the muscle, the skin, the lungs, and throughout the central nervous system. The second type of capillary system is a fenestrated capillary system. Fenestrated meaning there's small holes now, and you see that in the diagram here, these tiny little holes. These fenestrated capillaries have these small holes to allow some fluid exchange between the blood and the interstitial fluid, or the interstitial fluid being the fluid surrounding the cells of the body. You find these fenestrated capillaries in regions where you would expect a lot of exchange between organs, tissues, and the circulatory system, such as regions of the small intestine in which most of your digestive absorption is occurring, as well as within the endocrine glands in which hormones need to be exchanged into and out of the bloodstream, as well as with the kidney in which you're filtering the blood now to remove waste products for the vitality of the individual. And so you find these fenestrated capillaries with the tiny holes, again, where you need crosstalk between the blood and some essential organs to occur. And lastly, and somewhat interestingly, are the sinusoid capillaries. These have essentially large gaps between the endothelial cells, and this promotes the transport of very large molecules and cells to and from the blood. And so things such as cells and larger cholesterol molecules can leave the blood and enter into the tissue system through these sinusoid capillaries. They're mostly found in regions, again, where you would expect large cellular movement or large molecule movement to occur, things such as the bone marrow, which is where we're getting all of our blood cell, if you will, metabolism or generation, I should say, as well as in the spleen, the liver, the adrenal glands, the parathyroid glands, and the anterior pituitary. And so these sinusoid capillaries have a somewhat interesting architecture, but that architecture is necessary to allow large molecules and cells to move where needed. Okay, if we transfer over then to sort of the other side here, the vein side, veins are the blood vessels that drain the capillaries now and return the blood ultimately to the right atrium, the heart. As you can imagine, the pressure in the veins is much lower than in the arteries. And at rest, the body's veins hold about 60% of the body's blood. Thus, veins essentially also function not only as a vessel to bring blood back to the heart, but they also serve as, in essence, as a blood reservoir for the body. If we move into the different types of veins, there are the venules. These are the smallest veins. Essentially, the capillaries drain into the venules. The venules are really sort of the comparative structure to the arterioles. Their smallest ones are located at the end of the capillary bed and are called postcapillary venules. And diapedesis, which is essentially cell walking, or is the migration of leukocytes from the bloodstream to the body, occurs through the walls of these postcapillary venules. Ultimately, venules merge together to form veins. And veins, as you can see, are larger than the venules then. They're smaller and medium-sized veins travel through muscular arteries. And so what's interesting, again, is in order to get the blood to move back to the heart, the location of these veins are as such that they are located between two skeletal muscles. And it's this muscle contraction then that forces the blood through the structure and ultimately back to the heart. Blood pressure in the veins is too low to overcome the forces of gravity, as I had mentioned before, and so you'll also see a valve system located within the veins. And in addition, as I had just mentioned, as the skeletal muscles contract, they pump the blood towards the heart, and this process is called the skeletal muscle pump. And this is why if somebody is bedridden and is sort of stuck for a period of time in a hospital bed, for example, it's often necessary to have some sort of physical therapy for that individual so that they do move their skeletal muscles and get that contraction to prevent the blood from excessively pooling in the venous system network. And here's where I'll talk about one of the challenges with veins, and you probably may have heard about a condition called varicose veins. Varicose veins occur when the normal valve system of the veins begins to malfunction. And so in a normal vein, you see the blood would be flowing in this direction from the bottom of the screen to the top. And it's this intact valve system that prevents the backflow. In a varicose vein system, what you see is the vein architecture begins to collapse or break down, at which point the valve system no longer functions properly and the blood begins to backflow or pool in the vein. And that's what leads to this particular pattern of veins that you can see superficially now. And this can actually be corrected with laser ablation of these veins that ultimately are pooling the blood. At this point, now that we've discussed both the veins, the veins and the arteries, as well as the capillaries, let's move into another area that you're probably all maybe somewhat familiar with, and that is blood pressure. Blood pressure is simply defined as the force per unit area that blood places on the inside wall of a blood vessel, and we measure this in millimeters of mercury. It's measured using a It's measured using a sphygmomanometer, which is essentially an inflated cuff that temporarily stops the blood flow. And what the physician does is when they're using this instrument to measure your blood pressure, they simply pressurize enough to temporarily stop the flow of blood. They release the cuff and they listen to the brachial artery for the first sound of blood flow. And in essence, they're going to record this then as your systolic blood pressure. And this is a measure of ventricular systole or ventricular contraction. They then will continue to listen until that forceful sound can no longer be heard. This is now laminar flow of blood, and this is known as ventricular diastole or relaxation. So essentially what you're measuring when you measure blood pressure is your ventricular contraction, which is the top number, and your ventricular relaxation, which is the bottom number. And then the blood pressure is expressed as a ratio, and the average blood pressure is 120/80, 120 being your ventricular systole number, or the forcefulness of your ventricular contraction, the bottom number being the force of blood on the inside of your vessel wall when your ventricles are relaxing. And here you see in this particular diagram how blood pressure changes over the course of the vessels that blood travels throughout the body. And you see three things here, actually. Not only do we look at the blood pressure, but we can also look at blood velocity over the traveling through the vessels, as well as the total area of the vessels themselves. And let's look first at total area, because this is the simplest. If you look, and when you have the large arteries, the small arteries, and the arterioles make up a pretty small proportion of the total area of vessels that blood will flow throughout the body. This increases dramatically when we get to the capillaries, and so there is a large area of blood to travel through with respect to the capillary network, and again this begins to decrease somewhat when we move into the venules and the veins. if we look at the velocity or speed at which the blood travels, you see it's fairly high moving through the large arteries. Small arteries begins to slow down as it moves through the capillary network, again, mostly because of the large area of this network, and then increases again slightly in the venules and the veins. And lastly, blood pressure listed here in blue. You see a very high blood pressure, or the highest blood pressure, coming immediately off the heart in the large arteries, the small arteries. This begins to drop off considerably as you move through the arterioles, the capillaries, and ultimately remains low then through the venules and veins. Because again, remember, it's part of that skeletal muscle that's necessary to contract and move the blood through the vein system along with the valves to prevent backflow. Systemic circulation, as we kind of had mentioned before, consists of all the arteries and veins that travel to and from all parts of the body except the lungs. And so you see the systemic circulation of the arteries listed here on the left, systemic circulation for the venous network listed here, shown here on the right. Pulmonary circulation, though, deals with carrying deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart to the lungs and ultimately returning newly oxygenated blood to the left side of the heart. So pulmonary circulation deals only with the flow in blood from the heart to and from the lungs. In this type of circulation, this is where dogma, if you will, is broken a little bit, because arteries carry deoxygenated blood away from the heart, and veins are going to be carrying oxygenated blood back to the heart. And so the definitions remain the same. The arteries are still carrying blood away from the heart. Veins are still carrying blood towards the heart. But in pulmonary circulation now, arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood and veins are carrying oxygenated blood. Whereas in systemic circulation, that's very different. In systemic circulation, arteries are carrying oxygenated blood out to the body, and the veins are carrying the deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So be sure to keep that straight. Okay, and as I mentioned, for pulmonary circulation, deoxygenated blood being carried, it exits the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk, which ultimately splits into the right and left pulmonary arteries that go to the lungs. The arteries then begin to branch, much like we see in systemic circulation, into the arterioles and then ultimately into a capillary network. This is again in which the region in which the blood is now becoming oxygenated within the context of the lungs, and then finally returns to the left atrium, the blood now oxygenated through the pulmonary vein. And that's the end of our vessel lecture. I urge you to take this short quiz as a review and continue on with the rest of the module.